Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's time for our afternoon Bible study, and we're going to continue our study. Jesus paid it all, and the payment was permanent. And this is going to be part 5. And yes, I'm keeping track of the parts again, so I'm doing good. As we've kind of established a case for, once a person is truly saved, they can never lose that salvation. God's not going to let any of us go. And it then raised the question, well, is grace just a license to sin? And we've covered some of why grace is not a license to sin. We've covered that God tells us it's not, because he expects us to change after we're saved. We've talked about rewards for the believers, and today we're going to talk about another topic. And sin, even if we're forgiven of our sin, even if we're heaven bound, sin that we engage in here on this earth can have earthly consequences. These are not necessarily consequences that God hands out, although he can and will chastise us as he sees fit, but sometimes they're just a natural outflow of the things that we've done. You know, God has promised to save us from the penalty for our sin that we owed fair and square, but he doesn't have any obligation to protect us from the earthly fallout for the things we do. You know, just to throw some things out there, if we drink and drive, we're going to have a wreck and possibly get killed. If we commit crimes, we may have to do time in prison. If we fool around and cheat, we may face divorce and family divisions. If we live an unhealthy lifestyle due to drugs and so forth, we can suffer from the effects of that and chronic diseases. You know, God allows us to make choices, and he allows those consequences to unfold naturally. And we're going to talk about a couple of people briefly today that I don't think anybody has any doubt are in heaven with the Lord right now, and that's going to be King David and Moses. Moses, of course, was the greatest prophet ever, and David was a man after God's own heart. But we can see that some of the conduct of their lives had consequences that I'm certain they found very unpleasant during their life here. You know, David did some wrong things. David took another man's wife. He had that man murdered so that he could have his wife. He was certainly forgiven by God for those sins, but if you read, you can see that set up an environment in David's family that eventually led to the disintegration of his family and revolution of his kingdom. There's no doubt his sons looked at his example and thought that was a fine example to follow, and I say that tongue-in-cheek because it was not a fine example to follow. But we see, for instance, a story in 2 Samuel chapter 13, the rape of David's daughter Tamar by her half-brother Amnon, and then Amnon's subsequent murder by Absalom. And then we see Absalom banished from the kingdom, and then we see him later partially restored in 2 Samuel chapter 14. But that story didn't end then, because Absalom later rebelled against his father and tried to take the kingdom away. And that's in 2 Samuel chapters 15 through 19. So, you know, if we read these stories, we could draw the easy conclusion that David's failure as both a father and husband led to some very severe consequences. We might even be able to make a case that his other son Solomon behaved in some of the ways he did later in his life due to the example set by his father David. And then let's go to Moses, you know, the greatest prophet there ever was, led God's people out of Egypt and to the promised land. Well, we know if we go back in Numbers chapter 17 at Horeb, God commanded Moses, when the people grumbled because they had no water, to strike the rock, and water came out of it. Well, later in Numbers chapter 20, we see they're at Kadesh, and again the people are grumbling, and this time Moses got a little bit agitated about it. He got angry, and he was commanded by God to speak to that rock. Well, in his anger and frustration, he struck that rock twice. And guess what? Moses didn't get to go to the promised land. Because of his disobedience to God, God took away his right to enter the promised land. So as we can see, you know, true saving faith and salvation, it will produce works and it will produce fruit. Someday we're all going to be judged for the quality of our work. God will discipline us and chastise us for our actions, and we still face earthly consequences for the things we do. So once again, salvation is not a license to sin. Have a blessed afternoon, my friends.